Joining us now, the man himself, 2016, now official presidential candidate, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, good to see you. Welcome aboard.
Sean, always great to join you.
All right, those kids are adorable.
Well, thankfully, they look just like their mother.
Well, interesting, no teleprompter. First out of the gate, by design?
Well, it's certainly, it's time to get in there, and it's time to start making the case that we got to change what we're doing. You know, I think there is an urgency to what we're facing in politics that's unlike anything you or I have ever seen before. I think it's now or never. I don't think we've reached the point of no return yet, but we are close. And I think if
what is the point of no return?
Well, we've seen our national debt go from 10 trillion to 18 trillion. It's larger than the size of our whole economy. We're seeing our constitutional rights constantly under assault from the federal government. And we're seeing America recede from leadership in the world. And the world is melting down. I think if we have 4 or 8 more years on this same path, we risk doing irreparable damage to this country.
I'm going to get into the specifics on the economy, on foreign policy. First, a couple of questions about Ted Cruz. You went through a little bit of your family history and your family life story. Try and sum that up. Very fascinating background. I didn't know a lot of the things you said today.
Well, it was great. My family was all there and able to join me. I shared my mom's story. You know, my mom grew up in Wilmington, Delaware. She grew up in an Irish-Italian working-class family. Her mom, my grandmother, was the second youngest of 17 kids. I mentioned that my mom's uncle ran the numbers in Wilmington. I got to admit, my mother was a little horrified that I said that up there. And my grandfather, my mother's father, was a tough man. He drank too much, and he didn't have very enlightened views. He didn't really think women should get an education. And my mother is very soft-spoken, but she's strong-willed and very bright. And she stood up to her dad. She battled her father.
17 kids.
And, well, that was her mother.
Her mother, right.
And my mom became the first person in her family ever to go to college. And she went to Rice, graduated in 1956 with a degree in math, and went into computer programming at Shell. I mean, was shattering glass ceilings. And it's, my mom is 80 this year, and she was there at the event, and she's a woman of strength and fortitude, but also incredible compassion. She is a wonderful mom and an incredible grandmother to our 2 little girls.
And your dad fought Batista and Cuba, came here at 18.
He did. And one of the things I tried to do with the students at Liberty is try to help put them in his shoes. That he was 14, 15 years old. He was a kid in high school in student council when the revolution began. And the revolution in Cuba, it started in the student councils, in the high schools, in the colleges. And you know, I've sort of laughed. I was in student council growing up, but nobody would confuse our student council with revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. And my dad ended up, when he was 17, Batista's police captured him, and they threw him in prison and beat him halfway to death. And he fled Cuba. My grandfather told him, said, look, they know who you are. They're just going to hunt you down and kill you. And so he applied to 3 universities, applied to University of Miami, LSU, and University of Texas. And UT let him in. So my grandfather drove my father to the ferry boat. My father lay down on the floorboards in the bottom of the car to hide because Batista's police were keeping an eye on him. And he got on the ferry boat. He had a passport. He'd gotten a legal student visa from the American consulate because he'd been admitted to UT. He could get a student visa. And then they had a family friend who ended up, he needed a stamp from the Batista government to get out, and they weren't going to give it to him. And so a family friend ended up paying a bribe to the Cuban government authorities to get the Cuban stamp to let him out. Mm-hmm. And he took a ferry boat to Key West and then got on a Greyhound bus and went all the way to Austin and couldn't speak English, had $100 in his underwear.
It's a very similar story for a lot of families, my family as well. There have been issues. You were born in Calgary, in Canada.
Right.
Is there a birth certificate issue? I don't mean to. I know I did look at social media today, and it did come up a number of times. I want to give you a chance to address it. I know you mentioned it at CPAC.
Yeah. Look, there's political chatter on it. The facts are clear. I was born in Calgary. My parents, as a legal matter, my mother is an American citizen by birth, and it's been federal law for over 2 centuries that the child of an American citizen born abroad is a citizen by birth, a natural-born citizen, which is what the Constitution requires to run. And several prior candidates have had this issue. John McCain was born in Panama. George Romney, Mitt's dad, was born in Mexico when his parents were Mormon missionaries down there. And actually, Barry Goldwater, a lot of people don't know this, was born in Arizona before Arizona was a state. And so as a legal matter, the issue is quite straightforward, that if you or I travel abroad and we have a child that's born abroad and we're American citizens, that child is a natural-born citizen.
Why does Ted Cruz, why do you, Senator, want to be president? It's a big decision, big impact on your family. And how would a Cruz presidency differ from an Obama presidency?
Well, our country's in crisis, and we were talking just a minute ago. We've got to change the direction that we're on. One of the things I talked about this morning in the announcement speech is so many Americans across this country feel that the promise of America is drifting away from them, is unattainable. The miracle that was this nation, that our rights, we understand they come from God and not government, that government is limited, and that any one of us can come, like your family, like my family, with nothing and achieve anything. That's slipping away.
If you think that's slipping away, here are the numbers. 92 million Americans not in the labor force, highest number since the 70s, in Americans on food stamps.
Almost 50 now in poverty, almost 20 million more than when President Obama took office. 18 trillion in debt, 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Those are real economic problems. Specifically, how do you bring a budget in balance? How do you fix this economy? How do you get those people back in the labor force?
Well, we can turn it around, and how you do it is all interconnected. My first and top priority is growth and jobs and opportunity. You know, if you look at the federal budget, you're a numbers guy. There is only one first-order variable when it comes to the budget, and that is economic growth. Everything else is a second or third order variable. Everything else,
spending?
Even spending is a much smaller impact on the federal budget than growth. Historically in this country, we've averaged 3.3% growth a year since World War II. There have only been 2 4-year periods where growth has averaged less than 1% a year. 1978 to 1982. Now that was coming out of Jimmy Carter. Same failed economic policies. And then 2008 to 2012, where GDP growth averaged 0.9% a year. If we can get back to historic levels of growth, 3, 4, 5%, suddenly the federal budget picture transforms. Suddenly we have the revenue to take care and support our troops and build our military to defend this nation. Suddenly it becomes possible to step in and preserve and reform Social Security and Medicare. Suddenly it becomes possible to turn the problems around.
The way government works, you have baseline budgeting, where there's built-in increases every year. We've had this president will accumulate as much, if not more, debt than every other president before him combined.
Yes.
That's unsustainable, right? So spending has to be a part of it. Do you cut back? Do you curb spending?
Absolutely, yes. And, you know, one of the things you've advocated is the penny plan. I think the penny plan has an awful lot of force to it. And I am an emphatic advocate of a balanced budget amendment, putting in the Constitution a strong, balanced budget.
Every year it must be in balance. With the penny plan, it would cut 1 penny out of every dollar every year for 6 years, and you would get, without growth, a balanced budget in 6 years. Would you support cutting a penny out of every dollar, defense, Social Security, Medicare?
Look, you're going to be hard-pressed to come up with a cost-cutting program that I'm not going to support. I do think the military, we need to look at the growing national security threats, and we need to make sure we take care of the men and women of the military, and we provide what we need to protect this nation. And also, if you look at the budget, you cannot bring the budget into control without taking on entitlement reform. 2/3 of the federal budget is entitlement. So if you don't talk about entitlements, you can't do it.
Entitlements, means testing?
Absolutely.
Raise the age of eligibility?
Sure, yes.
So somebody who paid into their whole life into Social Security happens to have been successful, all that money that they were promised, no.
Well, look, I think any Social Security reform that you do, for those people who are seniors, for those people who are near retirement, we need to honor the commitments we've made to them.
Are you talking about future generations?
You're talking about future generations. People my generation, I'm 44. There are not a lot of people in my generation who think Social Security is going to be there.
I'm 53. I'm close to your generation, probably one step ahead. All right. I want to talk more about the economy, problem solving, what your answers are. We have a lot to get to. Coming up, we're just getting started with Senator Ted Cruz, and he'll be here for the entire show tonight. We're going to ask, if elected, what he'd do in his first 100 days if he's the commander-in-chief. And later, we want you, our viewers, you get in on the action. You can send us your questions via Facebook and Twitter, and we'll ask Senator Cruz some of those later in the show, so stay with us. All right, let me go back to the economy. 50 million Americans, food stamps, 50 in poverty. You have 92 million Americans out of the workforce, 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, 18 trillion in debt. All right. You talk about growth and getting it up to what the average growth has been, which we're not at this point. And you said you would cut spending, raise taxes. Do you think you can do all of this without raising any taxes?
Absolutely, yes. And if you look historically at how does growth happen, it doesn't come from government, it comes from the private sector. But government can screw it up. And historically, there have been 3 levers that government applies to create an environment where small businesses can create growth. And the whole focus should be small businesses, because 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. The first factor is tax reform. The more burdensome, the more complicated the tax code, the less growth you have. The simpler the tax code, the less burden, the more growth you have. There's a direct correlation.
And you wanted a flat tax, not a fair tax. Why flat over fair?
Look, I support a fair tax. If you gave me a button and I could push an ideal outcome, I'd push for the fair tax. I think a consumption tax makes more sense than a tax on production. But I think getting to a fair tax is going to take some real time. I think we still have a significant burden to persuade others. And I think a flat tax is a much more achievable middle ground. And so what I'm campaigning on is a simple flat tax where every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard.
All right. How big a part of the equation in the economy is health care? It's not, well, by the time the next person becomes president, if it's you, it will have been voted on about 7 years ago. That's a long time. It's almost institutional at that point. How do you repeal it? Costs have gone up some 24%. It's costing the government more than they originally estimated. What do you do, and how big a portion of that is in the economic equation of getting to that balanced budget?
It's a huge portion. As you know, today is the 5th anniversary of the president signing Obamacare into law. That's one of the reasons I announced this campaign today, because I think Obamacare has been the biggest disaster, the biggest train wreck. It has cost millions of Americans their jobs, forced them into part-time work, cost them their health care, their doctors, their health insurance premiums are skyrocketing. And listen, the sad reality is an awful lot of Republicans, both in Washington and outside of Washington, are resigned to leaving Obamacare in effect. I am convinced in 2017 we will see a Republican president in the White House sign legislation repealing every word of Obamacare, and then we will pass common sense health care reform that expands competition, that keeps government away from getting between you and your doctor, and that makes health insurance personal, portable, and affordable.
Okay. The New York Times pointed out today that the single most important issue or determinant in an election, I'm sure you read it, is the, quote, elites. I'll add to that, they quoted that you were the most hated man in the Senate. This dovetails right out of health care. And when you did your 22-hour filibuster, John McCain's called you a wacko bird, and you were called a bomb thrower by Senator Rick Santorum, 2 of your, I guess, biggest fans. But the question is, how do you, when they say you're the most hated man in the Senate, why is that? Why are some people in your party so against Ted Cruz and angry that you did the filibuster?
You know, Sean, when the New York Times says that the Washington elites despise me, My only question is whether I have to disclose that to the FEC as an in-kind donation. I mean, frankly, I can't think of a better ground to run on. Washington is broken. And it's both parties that aren't listening to the American people.
Do you think your party let you down when you stood on health care? In other words, you said if we stand together, we could get this done. And they didn't stand with you.
Look, it's not a question of letting me down. It's a question of letting down the people who elected us. Republicans all over the country campaign saying, if you elect us, we'll fight.
In other words, if every Republican stood, you think that it would have been successful?
I think it absolutely would have been successful. Now, would we necessarily have succeeded in, at the time, defunding all of Obamacare? I don't know. That was a difficult, it would have taken a perfect storm. But I think at a minimum, we would have provided meaningful relief for millions of people being hurt by Obamacare. But it's important to point out, you know, you and I were talking right in the midst of that defund battle, and all of the D.C. graybeards in both the Democrat and Republican Party were saying this is terrible, you shouldn't be fighting against this. And you remember, they all went on TV and they said, as a result of this, Harry Reid and the Democrats are going to keep the Senate. Well, it strikes me we had a little bit of a different result. And not only did we win an historic victory, the largest majority in the House since the 1920s, 9 Senate seats, retired Harry Reid as majority leader, but the #1 issue that we won the Senate on was stopping Obamacare. It was the most frequent campaign commercial of every Republican candidate. And it's interesting, it doesn't occur to any of those Republican elites or Washington elites that helping lead an effort that mobilizes and energizes millions of Americans to stop the train wreck that is Obamacare may have played a significant role in our winning the Senate.
Conservatives like myself, we've been critical of Republicans because they didn't fulfill their promise. There were a lot of show votes, symbolic votes on repealing Obamacare, but then when it came to using their constitutional power of defunding it, things got dicey. They didn't want to be blamed for a shutdown. Similarly, on the president's issue of executive orders with immigration. Do you think this president, through executive orders, do you think he's defying the Constitution?
Absolutely. I think President Obama has been the most lawless president we've ever had.
Is that impeachable? If in other words, in principle, is it, or is it something politically?
It is lawless. And at the end of the day, impeachment is a political question for the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is not moving forward with impeachment. One of the things that I tried to do for the previous 2 years, I was the ranking member on the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. We put out a series of 5 reports chronicling all of the ways in which President Obama has defied the Constitution, defied federal law. And it is a profound threat to our liberty. And if there is one thing that is my touchstone that I go back to over and over and over again, it's the Constitution of the United States. And I think that's going to be a central issue in this election in 2016.
Last question on the issue of the economy. How important is securing the borders, illegal immigration as it impacts the economy, criminal justice system, healthcare system, educational system? How big an issue?
Hey, look, it's hugely important. And the American people are largely agreed. Outside of Washington, there's bipartisan agreement, #1, that we got to secure the borders. First.
What do you do with the 11 million here?
You know, you don't have to answer every question one at a time. The first thing you should do is secure the borders. The second thing you should do, and you should do it at the same time, is improve and streamline legal immigration so that we can not just welcome but celebrate legal immigrants. My dad was an immigrant who came here seeking the American dream. We're a nation of immigrants. If you want to pass something through Congress, what you do is you focus on the areas of bipartisan agreement. Democrats always want to focus on the 11 or 12 million who are here illegally because it is the most divisive political question to focus on. I would suggest let's actually get something done to solve this problem by focusing where we agree. And once we demonstrate we can solve the problem, then we can have a discussion about the next step.
You know, it's interesting. If you hear spending cuts are coming, you always get the tax increase up front. You never get the spending cuts. I would argue you would always get the amnesty and never get the secure borders. So.
Well, and we saw that in the 80s. In the 80s, Congress told the American people, we'll grant amnesty for 3 million people, and in exchange, we'll secure the borders. What happened? The amnesty happened. The border never got secured. And I think the American people aren't interested in falling for the same deal a second time.
All right, Senator, we'll continue more with Senator Ted Cruz. How would he deal with America's enemies? That's coming up next. And later, well, what do you think our top 3 security issues are? and you said you would name radical Islamists.
Right.
Why do you think the president will not? He refuses to.
Look, it is a bizarre Orwellian doublespeak that this is a president who will not utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. And we see, for example, several weeks ago when you had the horrific terrorist attack in Paris, and he referred to it as a random act of violence. When radical Islamists go in with butcher knives to a kosher deli to murder Jews because of their Jewish faith, it's not random. Mm-hmm. It is naked anti-Semitism. Likewise, when 22 Coptic Christians were beheaded by ISIS, and the first White House statement came out and described it as they're being killed because of their Egyptian citizenship. They weren't killed because of their citizenship. They were killed because they were Christians, because radical Islamic terrorists were murdering them because of their faith. And I'll tell you, Pope Francis, his comment, what was their blood confesses Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. We can't confront the evil that we're facing if we refuse to acknowledge it for what it is, or if the president is an apologist for it, which is what he was at the prayer breakfast.
What do you think it's going to take? A lot of people, military people, will tell you that we ultimately will need boots on the ground to deal with ISIS. Do you agree with that?
I think it should be driven by the military objective. I think the objective should be to destroy ISIS. Now, we do have boots on the ground with the Kurds. The Peshmerga, the fighting forces of the Kurds, are effective, able fighters. They're allies of the United States. We should be arming them. The Obama administration is sending weapons to Baghdad who won't pass it on to the Kurds. So in my view, the Kurds should be our principal boots on the ground. We should be using overwhelming Air Force power. And then beyond that, if we need to embed special forces or have some limited ground troops, driven by the mission, we should. But it shouldn't be a political decision, yes, boots on the ground, no boots on the ground. It should be a military decision, what's necessary to destroy ISIS.
Do you think the president made a mistake? George Bush, the president, warned in 2007 that if we don't keep intelligence forces and training forces on the ground, that the enemy will get worse and we will have to go back in. It seems that it was a prediction that ended up fairly accurate.
Well, it was, and there were many mistakes, but the most pervasive one is projecting weakness to the world. The consistent pattern of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy has been abandoning our friends and allies, whether it is Israel, whether it is the UK, whether it is Canada, and coddling and appeasing our enemies. And that message of weakness has been heard. It's why Putin is bellicose and invading his neighbors. It's why China is more and more aggressive in Asia, and it is why Iran is galloping towards nuclear weapons capability. And the latter, Iran, I think, is the single greatest national security threat facing America.
Iran is number one. What's number two?
Radical Islam generally.
Number three?
A more aggressive Russia.
Okay, let's start with number one. How do you deal with Iran? You hear about the president in the sunset years of this deal that they, in the meantime, they'd be able to spin their centrifuges, some 6,000 of them. In the short term, they'd be able to enrich uranium, and at the end of this 10-year period, ultimately be able to build a nuclear weapon.
I agree with what Prime Minister Netanyahu said many, many months ago, that this deal is a very, very bad deal and an historic mistake. This deal paves the path towards Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And if they acquire nuclear weapons, I think the odds are unacceptably high they'd use them, either against Israel or America. Now, your question was, what should we do? I've introduced legislation in the Senate that would immediately reimpose sanctions on Iran, that would strengthen them to make them more crippling, and then lays out a clear roadmap for how they can lift them. If they want to lift them, they would have to disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges, hand over all of their enriched uranium, shut down their ICBM program, which exists only to carry a nuclear weapon to America, and stop being the leading world state sponsor of terrorism. We should have more stick and less carrot.
This very weekend, our Secretary of State said we're close to a deal at the very same moment with the top Iranian mullah chanting death to America. Is that somebody we should even be sitting down at the table with?
And Sean, every year in Iran, they celebrate what's called Death to America Day. It is the anniversary of Iran taking Americans hostages in the 1970s. If history teaches one thing, it is that if somebody tells you they want to kill you,
believe them.
Believe them.
What do you think about the president and his treatment of Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel?
It is shameful. It is disgraceful. This administration has been the most antagonistic administration to Israel in the history of this country.
Last question. So you mentioned number 3 is Putin. We talked about
Yes.
terrorism. We talked about Iran. How do you deal with his territorial ambitions? How do you stop Putin? I mean, the price of oil has crippled his economy a little bit, but...
Yes. Look, Putin is fundamentally a KGB thug. He's not a complicated man. He's been very candid. He says he considers the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he has stated he's trying, I believe, to reassemble as much of it as possible. Putin only understands strength. Now, listen, nobody wants to see a shooting war between America and Russia. 2 nuclear superpowers, you don't engage in a shooting war. But there we can be doing. We should be standing with Ukraine and arming Ukraine right now so the Ukrainians can defend themselves. We should honor our treaty commitments. We should have, when Putin invaded Crimea, we should have immediately gone forward and installed the anti-ballistic missile batteries in Poland and the Czech Republic that had been scheduled to go into effect and that the president had canceled in 2009 in an effort to appease Putin. The appeasement didn't work. And third, we should immediately clear for export liquid natural gas. Putin uses energy as his tool of economic blackmail. It produced jobs here at home, and it would weaken Russia and empower our friends.
Could we be energy independent in 5 years? And how big an impact on the economy?
We could absolutely be energy independent in North America. If you bring in Canada and Mexico, the reserves we have in North America.
Because Putin can turn off the spigot to Western Europe, therefore he has a lot of leverage.
That is exactly right, and I've introduced in the Senate the American Energy Renaissance Act, the most comprehensive legislation to unchain the private sector to create millions of high-paying jobs. You want growth, you want to solve the budget and the deficit and the debt, millions of high-paying jobs in energy and also in manufacturing from low-cost energy is a critical element to how we do it.
All right, coming up, not everybody, by the way, is excited. Senator Ted Cruz has announced he's running for president. Up next, we'll give him an opportunity to respond to some of his critics. And then later, you, our viewers, you get to ask Senator Cruz questions. Go to Facebook, go to Twitter, at Sean Hannity, and some of those questions coming up straight ahead. Now, as rumors of his candidacy began to surface, the left, predictably, jumped on the chance to begin criticizing Senator Cruz for his qualifications as a leader, to the way and his eligibility as a U.S. citizen, and much more. He's here for the entire hour tonight. Here's one thing I can guarantee, and I mentioned earlier some of your Republican critics. You know they're all, Jerry Brown over the weekend. You know all the things people have said. One thing I can guarantee you, whoever is the Republican nominee is going to be labeled as racist, sexist, wants to kill grandma, hates children, and you know the list of things. How, forgetting all these people, Jerry Brown, I don't think that bothers you, or John McCain calling you a wacko bird. But how do you deal with the Clinton machine and the predictable, I guess, narrative that is advanced every election cycle against any Republican or conservative? How do you handle that?
Well, look, you're right. The media historically paints 2 caricatures of Republicans. We're either stupid or evil. So in the media, or both.
Right.
In the media's telling, Reagan was stupid, George W. Bush was stupid, Dan Quayle was stupid, Nixon was evil, Dick Cheney was evil. By the way, stupid is better. If you're picking one or the other, stupid is much better.
Better than evil.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I take it as a little bit of a backhanded compliment that the media has, to some extent, invented a 3rd caricature for me, which is crazy.
Okay, because you're smart. You went to Harvard and Princeton, or Harvard and, Princeton.
Well,
okay.
and so they do everything they can to paint me as a wild-eyed lunatic with dynamite strapped around my chest.
Yeah. Well, you know who says nice things about you? Alan Dershowitz. Austin Goolsbee said you were probably his most formidable, debater that he ever had to go up against. Well, so you have this history. So, but you've got this, we hear it's a coronation. Probably Hillary Clinton is going to be your opponent if you win this primary. They have a machine. They have a war room. What do you think of Hillary, and how do you deal with her campaign?
Listen, I think the way you deal with the war room and the media chatter is the same way Reagan did it. The media has always been a disaster. In 1980, they hated Reagan. They hate Republicans now. They hate conservatives even more. What Reagan did is he went over their head, and he went directly to the American people. You know, one of my favorite exchanges is a classic press briefing at the White House where Reagan is there, and Sam Donaldson says, Mr. President, you have blamed the problems in this country on everybody else. You blame them on Tip O'Neill, on Democrats in the Congress. Mr. President, you're President of the United States. Don't you bear any of the responsibility for the problems in this country? And Reagan leaned forward with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, well, Sam, yes. Yes, I do. I bear considerable responsibility because for many years, I was a Democrat. And even Donaldson cracks up laughing.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. We go over the heads of the reporters, and it's easier now. We've got social media, we've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, we've got, God bless, Fox News, we've got the internet, we've got the Drudge Report, we've got talk radio.
Yeah.
We have all of the tools. The media gatekeepers are hopeless, but we can go directly to the people with the truth.
All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back, and we've been asking for your feedback all day on Facebook and Twitter. Coming up next, Senator Cruz will answer your questions. That's straight ahead. Welcome back to Hannity. Texas Senator Ted Cruz officially announced he's running for president in 2016. Now, well, it's your turn to ask him some questions. All right, we start with Twitter. All right, your message resonates with conservatives very well. How will you attract independent votes?
Look, if you think about it, in the last 50 years, there is only one Republican who has a group of Democrats named after him. Reagan Democrats. The way you earn crossover votes is you stand for principle, you paint in bold colors. Let me tell you a quick story. I was in California a few months ago, and I was at an event. A woman brought in a poster and asked me to sign this poster to another woman named Kristen for her birthday. She said, let me tell you about Kristen. I said, okay. She said, Kristen is a liberal California Democrat. I said, all right, so I'm signing happy birthday, Kristen.
Right.
She said, Kristen called me 2 weeks ago, and she said, I picked my horse for 2016.
Right.
And she said, oh, okay, great, you're backing Hillary. She said, no, I'm backing Cruz. She said, what are you talking about? And Kristen said, I just got my health insurance bill. I can't afford Obamacare, and I think he's the only guy that'll actually repeal the dang thing.
Let's go to Facebook. How will you address the diversity of the American people? Because Obama and Holder set race relations back about 20 years.
Well, listen, I am a Cuban, Irish, Italian-man. Raised in Texas, and I think we are together a melting pot of cultures. We come together, and I also think we do that by not treating people in buckets, pigeonholing them, but rather appealing to universal values, liberty, individual rights, the Constitution. That brings us together rather than dividing us.
Have you ever in your adult life worked a job earning minimum wage? What experience have you had that gives you any perspective on what the middle class goes through on a daily basis?
Well, my first job was when I was in grade school. I was paid $1 an hour by my dad. When I was in high school, my parents went bankrupt. So when I went to college, I was 17, and my parents had no money whatsoever. I was financially self-sufficient. I took 2 jobs.
From 17, you've been financially...
From 17 on, I took 2 jobs to pay my way through college, took $100,000 in school loans that I just paid off a few years ago.
Difference between you and me, same with me, except, you know, I'd go to college, run out of money, go to work, go to college, run out of money, go to work, and then I never finished because I got behind a radio microphone. Senator, we're going to continue more with our GOP presidential candidate, Senator Ted Cruz, right after the break. Straight ahead. Now, before we go tonight, we're going to give Senator Cruz just 60 seconds, uninterrupted, in his own words, to explain why he thinks he is the best Republican for you to choose to be the next president in the United States. Senator.
I'd say 2 things. Number one, we have to win in November 2016. We can't have 4 or 8 more years going down this road. The only way to win is to bring back to the polls the millions of conservatives who've been staying home, the millions of Christians, the millions of Reagan Democrats who have been staying home. As I look at the field, I see a lot of good people who I like, who I respect, but I don't see a whole lot of candidates who I think can energize and mobilize the conservatives who stayed home in 08 and 12. If we don't bring them back, Hillary Clinton's the next president. And the second thing I would say is we need a leader who'll stand up and tell the truth and who will lead on the great issues of the day, whether it's Obamacare or our debt or stopping executive amnesty or defending religious liberty or defending the Second Amendment or standing up for life or for marriage or for Israel or standing up against Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. We need leaders who stand and lead. And That's what I've endeavored to do in my time in the Senate, and my commitment is in this race in 2016, that's what I'm going to do going forward.
Senator, thank you for taking time tonight. Appreciate it for the hour. And that is all the time we have left this evening. Before we go, quick programming note.